Good afternoon and welcome to everybody. I'm Jason Mazzoni. I'm a professor at the University of Illinois College of Law, and welcome to our event today. Next Tuesday, as we all know, is Election Day, and there are two possibilities. One possibility is that we'll stay up late and learn in the hours after the polls close the outcome of the presidential election and the outcomes in the Senate races and the results from the House elections. And then whether our preferred candidates won or lost, we'll all go back to our normal business. The other possibility is that that doesn't happen, and that instead, in the days after the election, there are challenges, challenges to individual ballots, challenges to the counting of ballots, challenges to the tabulation of results, maybe even challenges to the integrity of the election itself. Those challenges might be limited to a few states, though those states might be key states in terms of determining the electoral college outcome, or the challenges might be more widespread. The challenges might be resolved quickly or more slowly, resolved in an orderly manner, or one that is not so orderly. And so here today to help us think about the likelihood of state election results being contested beyond election day and what happens or might happen if they are. We have two experts on voting and election law. Vic Amar is no stranger, the Dean of the College of Law here. And he's joined by Professor Rick Pildes from New York University School of Law. If you've been watching the news, you'll know that we have the right people for the job. This week, Professor Pildes' scholarship was quoted by Justice Kavanaugh in his opinion on a case out of Wisconsin. Maybe we can ask Professor Pildes about that. And Dean Amar is the author this week of an opinion piece in the New York Times on the role of the Supreme Court in reviewing election disputes out of the state courts. It's been getting a lot of attention. We have just under an hour, and Vic and Rick are going to tell us what they're thinking about as we head towards the election. I might ask a question or two. If you in the audience have questions, you can type them in the chat box or raise your virtual hand and we'll try to get to you. Otherwise, please keep your microphones muted so you don't create background noise. And we are recording the event. So with that, Rick, thank you for joining us and welcome to you. What's on your mind as we head to elections?
Well, since these discussions quickly devolve into imagining the sort of nightmare scenarios that could happen and all the intricate moves and counter moves, let me start actually with some more positive and optimistic accounts of where we are, and then we can talk as we go about some of the concerns. So two things on the optimistic side. One is, I think it's entirely possible that we will know much more by the wee hours on November 4th, essentially what's happening in the election, meaning who is going to win. That's different from what most of the conversation has been, which is when the networks will formally declare a winner, meaning they will project that someone is going to get 270 electoral votes. There are going to be some states that certainly are not going to get their counts done by the wee hours of election morning or the next morning. I'm not sure how to talk about it, November 4th. And that might preclude the networks from being able to officially declare they're willing to say someone's going to get 270 electoral votes. But there are states that are likely to get to very complete counts, including counting their absentee ballots by late election night or early the next morning, some of which are very important, like Florida, number one, North Carolina, probably as well, probably Arizona. And we will know if Joe Biden wins, I think really any of those states based on the maps, but certainly if Joe Biden wins Florida or North Carolina, that President Trump will have almost no path to re-election. So we might not have the totals from Wisconsin or Pennsylvania or Michigan, but we would know a great deal and really most of what we need to know in terms of having a sense that there's a definitive winner. The second thing we'll know is that even in states that can't complete a count with all of the absentees by late election night or early the next morning, Some of the counties in those states will be able to do that. And some of those counties can be very important counties. And what the media will do is they will compare how President Trump is doing this year versus how he did in those counties in 2016. And again, that could provide very strong signals. If he's doing significantly better, he's on a very good path. If he's doing about the same, we may be in for a very close election. And if he's doing considerably worse, again, we'll have a sense of where this is all going. So it might well not be that we're going to be left hanging for what the media is talking about as election week. It's good the media is talking that way, by the way. They do need to educate voters to potentially be patient. The second kind of big picture point I want to emphasize on the more positive side at the start here is that although we get completely focused, especially at the last minute here, on all of these court decisions and issues about 3-day extensions of ballot receipt or not, and the like, we have to step back, I think, and remember where we were in the spring and in the summer as the reality of the pandemic set in and we began to confront the problems of conducting an election during the pandemic. We have made in our election systems vast changes in response to that, which are in a way less visible because they're not the subject of litigation. And we have successfully dealt, it seems, with some of the biggest concerns. So number one, 45 states have ended up allowing every voter who wants to vote with an absentee ballot to do that. And that includes 11 states, 6 Republicans, 5 Democratic, that changed their policies to permit that. On top of that, we have significantly expanded early voting options. And so there are states like Kentucky, which allowed no early voting before this year, that now have 3 weeks of early voting. In Texas, the governor there, who's been the subject of a lot of litigation, but early on issued an executive order expanding early voting there by an additional 6 days, meaning, as you're now seeing, Texas has 2.5 weeks of early voting. And that's gone on in a number of states as well. In fact, New York, which is some of the worst election laws in the country where I live, we are voting, we have the option to vote early, which I still hope to be able to do. Haven't managed to get the time yet, for the first time in a presidential election ever. The other thing is we had tremendous concerns about poll workers and whether we'd be able to staff traditional polling places. Now, with all the early voting that's going on and the return of absentee ballots early, that may also take significant pressure off of election day voting. But on top of that, the worry about poll workers is that 2/3 of them are 60 or over. They're in a higher vulnerability health category. In the primaries, many of them were not willing to work. Many of them also said they weren't willing to work this fall. But there has been a tremendously successful effort that's been made to staff those with new poll workers, including younger poll workers, and most places have reported that they're in good shape on that. So you're seeing that in the numbers. We have highly mobilized voters who are able to take advantage of the early voting options in person and through absentee voting. And what we are seeing is, staggering in terms of the amount of participation we've had already. A state like Texas, which by the way, does not allow anyone to vote absentee. It's one of the 5 states that still has narrow justifications that permit you to vote absentee. That was challenged in court, those challenges lost. But Texas, 95% as of today of the number of voters who voted in 2016 have voted. 95%, that's just, I find that staggering. And 90% of those used early voting. So even without no excuse absentee voting, turnout in Texas is already off the charts. We now are pretty confident this is going to be the highest turnout election since 1908. That number is even more impressive because ever since we lowered the voting age to 18, when we amended the Constitution, starting with the 1972 presidential election, turnout has consistently been lower because younger people tend to vote at lower rates. They are turning out in huge numbers in all the states that have reported information on that so far. So, there are lots of things to worry about, but I sometimes worry in these discussions, we move so quickly into all of the high anxiety, nightmare kind of scenarios that we don't take a breath and kind of remind ourselves of how far we've come, what the big picture looks like, how high the level of participation is already, nationally. Well more than 50% of the vote from last time has already taken place. So let me start with those opening comments. There'll be time enough to talk about the potential problems.
Great, thank you so much. A kind of happy story so far. So Vic, we'll turn to you.
So I agree with, I think, everything Rick said. I think we do have to prepare for the worst, but we needn't kind of assume that the worst is going to happen. We can be hopeful here. 80 million people as of yesterday had already voted. Rick can correct me, but I think only about 130 some million voted altogether in 2016.
Yeah, about 135, yeah.
And so, my guess is that by Monday, we're going to be at or near 100 million, which is pretty darn amazing. Especially as given, as Rick said, that, some states still resist, absentee voting without any excuse. I do think that, once things go south, so look, if Florida and North Carolina and Arizona are bellwether states, I can go to sleep, and even if there's no certifications and no CNN or CBS projections, I can live with that. I remember in 2016, thinking early on, Virginia was so tight, and I'm thinking this is not good for someone who voted for Hillary Clinton, as I admit that I did. And that was a bellwether because I thought Virginia was not going well. I still didn't expect Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan to do what they did. That kind of shocked me. But you always get some indications early on based on states where you can see some exit polling and the like. When things do move into the courts, if they do, assuming that we don't have a clear winner in any of those states, let's say let's say Florida and North Carolina and Arizona all end up in Trump's category where he's leading or it's very close, then places like Pennsylvania become huge. And, I think courts so far have demonstrated what I would characterize as a mixed track record in fairly adjudicating some of these claims. Jason, you mentioned the op-ed that I wrote in the New York Times. I have a Justia column today that I know you've read that delves in a lot more detail addressing this theory that was invoked in Bush versus Gore and embraced by 3 of the justices in the Bush versus Gore ruling, that somehow when Article 2 of the Constitution mentions the legislatures of the states as the entities having the power to direct the manner of picking electors, that means that the state courts should be subject to federal judicial oversight, even as they construe state election laws against the backdrop of state constitutional right to vote principles. I actually am one of the few people who wrote about this issue well before Bush versus Gore in 1999. I thought that legislature does not mean independent elected legislature, but rather means the lawmaking processes of the state. That vision was affirmed 5 years ago in the Arizona Redistricting Commission case, albeit in the Article 1 context that dealt with congressional elections. Article 1, like Article 2, refers to the legislatures of the states and empowers them to regulate federal congressional elections. But there's no meaningful difference between the language of Article 1 and Article 2, and there's no meaningful difference in the history of the two with respect to the key question, namely, did those provisions have anything to do with a federal constitutional decision to regulate intrastate separation of powers, to choose one entity within a state government and exalt it over others. So the state legislature is much more important than the state courts or the state constitution or the state agencies. There's no history to support that. So, until this week, I didn't expect there to be much traction for this argument. But then, of course, we saw Justice Kavanaugh on Monday in the ruling that you mentioned, Jason, involving Wisconsin, where he gratuitously included a footnote. The gratuitous part was not the citation to Rick. That was part of the text, and that wasn't gratuitous. But the footnote about about state court oversight was rather gratuitous, and he repeatedly endorsed the Bush versus Gore concurrence reading of the word legislature. And then again, later in the week, you had Justices Gorsuch and Alito echo that. Although, interestingly, on Wednesday, Justice Kavanaugh did not join them on that. We still don't know precisely why. Maybe he read some stuff and realized that he needs to rethink all this. But in any event, we have Justice Barrett on the court, and we don't know what's going to happen. That is certainly one avenue of potential attack, that state election boards or state courts are not being faithful to the legislative enactments, as if the federal Constitution requires state statutes to be interpreted literally or narrowly or any other way, which is why I think the whole legislature means only the elected legislature is a bogus argument. But it's not just about that. Rick mentioned the Texas litigation, and I just want to say a word about that. I wrote a column about that as well because it really offended me. Texas has a statute that says you can't get an absentee ballot as a matter of right unless you are in jail and otherwise entitled to vote, you're an elderly person, or you attest that you're not going to be in the state when you need to vote. And there might have been a fourth category as well, I can't remember. But the amendment to the Constitution, the 26th Amendment that Rick referred to, that lowered the voting age to 18 and included all the young people in the voting base, by its terms says the right to vote shall not be denied on account of age. It's as clear constitutional text as you're going to get. And you have a state law that doesn't simply have a disparate impact along age lines. It singles out a category of people, elderly people, and gives them an entitlement to vote that it's not giving to anyone else, a choice, an option to vote absentee. That is a denial or abridgment on the basis of the right to vote. And yet, by a 2-to-1 margin, the Fifth Circuit rejected that argument. And of course, the US Supreme Court didn't intervene. I'm not even sure that cert was sought. But these cases are unpredictable, and they don't really hew to any particular methodology. They're not textual. They're not functional. They're idiosyncratic, and they're based on views of the justices or judges that may not be able to anticipate ex ante. And I say that because one of the two judges who upheld Texas's clearly unconstitutional, facially unconstitutional law was a Democrat. She was actually the one who dissented in the Fifth Circuit ruling regarding Obamacare and what happened, and whether the elimination of the tax penalty in 2017 brought down the insurance requirement, so-called mandate provision, and if so, what that does to the rest of the act. She dissented from the Fifth Circuit, so she's not a kind of a super conservative judge, and yet she voted to uphold that law. Now, I point out that she's 80 years old. She is a Carter appointee, and maybe it was intuitive to her why elderly people should get a special dispensation here. But that's not the basis on which I want judges deciding these important decisions. So, I'm not paranoid about what's going to happen. Hearing Rick makes me feel a little bit better. I'd like to hear Rick delve into what the preliminary data in all these states that have had such high numbers of people voting. I know we haven't had formal exit polls, but we know something about the demographics of who's been voting. I would like to, be put at ease that I have some predictive insight based on that. But once it moves to a contested realm, it's a messy arena, and it could be far worse than 2000 itself, because there at least every result that mattered other than Florida was clear. Here, as Rick pointed out, you've got North Carolina, you've got Pennsylvania, you've got Arizona, and then maybe Georgia's in play on the other side, or Ohio's in play on the other side, as well as Florida. So it's a lot of moving pieces, and it's going to be complicated for that reason. So I'll turn it back over to Jason and/or Rick if he wants to comment on anything I observed.
I'll let Jason ask a question, see what direction he wants to take us.
So Rick, what would be the first sign of a problem, that things are not going according to the sort of happier account that you gave us?
Well, let me start with a cautionary note about that, because one of the things I am concerned about, which has not gotten a tremendous amount of discussion, I don't think yet, is that we are so primed, many voters, many people on both sides of the spectrum, to believe nefarious, sinister things are going on. There are going to be problems at the polls on election day. There always are. There are likely to be additional problems this year because we're voting under unique circumstances, with many more people who, for example, requested absentee ballots, but may decide to show up and vote in person. That can slow the process down. The election officials have to make sure that ballot wasn't already cast. If you don't bring the ballot in with you that you requested, that you now no longer want to use, then you may have to vote out what's called a provisional ballot. Those don't get counted until after the election. There are probably going to be some issues. I think it's going to be very important for the media and for voters with their phones taking pictures and tweeting to try to sort of slow down, get a sense of what the facts actually are before rumors fly around as rapidly as they will and get amplified on social media. It'll be important for journalists to put any problems that do arise in context and in proportion, because there are many problems, especially with reporting and social media during the election process on election day. If problems get raised to a level that kind of really exaggerates what's in fact happening on the ground. So a few incidents, a few places that then get talked about enough that it seems like it's much more widespread. One of the things that happens is that less motivated voters tend to decide, I'm not gonna show up. I don't want to get in the middle of that. It sounds chaotic. It sounds like a mess. It opens up, if there are exaggerated or misleading accounts of what's actually happening, it opens up paths to challenge the process, whether or not there are actually problems. It helps delegitimate the election. I mean, again, real problems do have to be talked about, of course. But in my role, at least, as a commentator, visible commentator on this, I tend to try to slow down and make sure we know what the facts are and to put things in context. Now, the sign that we're going to have problems is if it looks like the election is going to be very close, because here's some of the darker kind of facts to put into the mix now. Number one, polling data shows that about 25% of people, and this was actually several weeks ago still, I don't know if this has been polled more recently, 25% of people on both sides already believed a few weeks ago that the only way their candidate could lose is if the election is rigged. Okay. Believe it or not, in a Pew study that looked at this question over a number of years, back in 2017, only about 8% of people said they were prepared to use a little violence in pursuit of what their political ends. Supposedly, I find this hard to believe, but about 40% of Democrats and Republicans on September 1 answered that question affirmatively. A little violence. Number two, back in 2000, when we had our disputed Bush v. Gore election, social media barely existed and played almost no role. Cable television even was just getting going. Now, of course, we know how the social media communications universe operates on the dark side. And we know what's going to happen if we're in a close election. And the way misinformation, disinformation, intentional, unintentional attributions of sinister motives to actors will move rapidly through that system, get elevated, get amplified. We have candidates who are prepared to delegitimate the election process without any question. We've already seen some of that in advance of the election. And speaking of the courts, in our highly polarized political culture, all of our public institutions have come to be seen much more through partisan lenses. So if the courts have to get involved to decide major issues, whether it's the Supreme Court or lower down, state Supreme Courts, the losing side, I think, is going to be predisposed to believe the judges, they must have lost because the judges were doing this for partisan reasons, whether that's accurate or not. And so I don't have confidence if we get into a really close election, which almost by definition will become a contested election. I don't have confidence we have the institutional legitimacy with the various institutions that would have to be involved to help resolve this process, even if they act perfectly appropriately and validly, that those institutions and whatever outcomes are generated through them will be widely accepted. And so I think that puts us in a potentially dangerous and explosive situation. I have particular concerns about particular states. There's no question that number one on my list is Pennsylvania, which has a toxic combination of being an extremely critical state with the worst election policies in the country. I can go through some of these. I have been hammering away at this on Pennsylvania for many months. The governor and the legislature there, a Democratic governor, Republican legislature, were at loggerheads. They couldn't make the changes that needed to be made, even ones where there should have been room for agreement, but they couldn't do it. And so, in particular, if we end up in a close election with Pennsylvania being potentially decisive, that's a bad spot. That's a bad place for the country if we end up in that spot.
So Vic, do you want to jump in on this? Maybe I can ask you your assessment of that last point that Rick made. I mean, given what the Supreme Court did this week with respect to Pennsylvania, concerns about Pennsylvania being the deciding state?
Yeah, I share Rick's kind of pessimism about no matter what the outcome, if it comes down to litigation and a fight in Pennsylvania after Tuesday, that there really is there's no happy outcome to that, even though there'll have to be a resolution. So what happened in Pennsylvania so far? Rick mentioned that the governor is Democrat and the legislature is Republican. The Supreme Court tends to be more progressive and has Democrats on it. And the Supreme Court issued a couple of rulings under the state constitution and under state election statutes, one of which said that if your ballot is postmarked by election day, but is received within 3 days after the election day, it can still be counted. And indeed, it must still be counted under the state constitution. A second decision that was more grounded in statutory analysis than explicit resort to the state constitution overriding the legislature, although all these cases involve an interplay between statutes and constitutional provisions, dealt with ballots that had a technical flaw in the so-called in the completion of the signature requirement. And there too, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruled that those ballots can and should be counted. So initially, Republicans in Pennsylvania went to the Supreme Court and asked for a stay of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court's order that directed state election officials to count these ballots in the case of the ballots that were postmarked by Election Day, in that case. And by a 4-4 vote, the Supreme Court declined to grant that stay, but it was 4-4, which surprised some people. Some of you might remember, Rick will of course remember, that after the famous Rucho case in 2019, holding that the federal constitution, or at least the federal courts, have no role to play in policing excessively partisan gerrymandering, districting, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court issued a ruling that invalidated the state legislature's districting plan, even as to congressional districts, as being violative of a state constitutional prohibition on excessive partisanship. So they found there to be a state constitutional limit on what the legislature could do. And Republicans sought review in the Supreme Court of that. And when the Supreme Court denied review in that, I breathed a sigh of relief. I thought, well, this Bush versus Gore silliness is done. But it's not done, and things are never done. It's like discussions I have with members of my family. They never get resolved. I'm not talking about my brother, Rick. I'm talking about my spouse and other people. So anyway, the Republicans in Pennsylvania took another run at it after Justice Barrett was confirmed, figuring that maybe now she could be the fifth vote. Now, they didn't seek a kind of a motion for considering a rehearing, because that would have been extraordinary to ask for a rehearing of a denial of a stay application. Instead, what they said is, okay, don't block the Pennsylvania court's ruling, but just grant our cert petition and expedite the merits so that you can issue a ruling on this case before Election Day. And the Supreme Court denied that request, that invitation, this time by a 5-3 vote, with Justice Barrett technically on the court but not participating, both because she said she didn't have time to read the papers and because she's a smart person who would not want to jump into any of this unless you absolutely had to. What's the upside here, really? But this time, Justice Kavanaugh, who had sent this missive in that footnote in the Wisconsin case we talked about earlier, he wasn't joining the other three. So he joined Chief Justice Roberts in rejecting the cert petition and the expedition. Now, there may be more explanation from Justice Kavanaugh still to come. The court yesterday said possibly more opinions to follow. But it might be that Kavanaugh has thought the better of this whole theory of legislature means legislature and nobody else. Or maybe he just thought there's too much water under the bridge, that people are already voting or building their voting plans in reliance on the ability to mail in their ballot and have it count as long as it's postmarked by Election Day. And the longer we go with that being the status quo, the harder it would be to undo that. Jason, you and I had a post today on balkanization on just that point. Rick himself, he said he hasn't voted yet. That troubled me a little bit, although it's New York, so but he's got a plan. And if the rules changed on him, given his busy schedule, that would not be cool. So that's where we are in Pennsylvania right now. I'll just mention one other thing. If Rick wants to kind of descend to this minutia, and I pray to God that we never get there, but there is a statute that Congress passed in the 1880s called the Electoral Count Act, which purports to lay out a process for how to decide which slate of electors represents a state when there are competing factions within that state presenting two competing slates of electors to Congress. And it tries to help Congress figure out which slate to actually credit. And there's a lot of uncertainty about the statute. There are some constitutional questions about parts of it. But assuming that it isn't invalidated in significant measure, when you pull the thread on that statute all the way down, and there's a kind of an intractable disagreement between Democrats and Republicans, both in the state and in Congress, about which slate represents the state, it's ultimately, according to the statute, the executive branch, the governor, who gets to make the call and represent which slate actually speaks for the state. And in Pennsylvania, as in Wisconsin, even though you've got Republican legislatures, you've got Democratic governors. Now, again, a lot would have to happen before we get to that place. I will say just one other thing. A lot of people have written, Ned Foley at Ohio State, since you were just in Columbus, Rick, I'll mention Ned. He wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post the other day that I found quite bizarre, to be honest with you, where he said that a legislature like Pennsylvania's, if they don't like the way the election tallies are looking, they can simply pass a law, pass a resolution adopting their own slate of electors. And one thing is clear, even before the Arizona districting case I mentioned, and putting Bush versus Gore to one side, in Smiley versus Holman, I believe 1932, the Supreme Court held that when it comes to the legislature passing these laws, even if legislature excludes courts and agencies and the people directly in direct democracy, legislature includes the governor if that's the ordinary process by which laws are made. Again, at least for Article 1, so I would assume for Article 2, whose text is very similar. So for the Pennsylvania legislature to do anything, and I'm not sure it could, because federal law says you got to pick your electors by election night. You can't pick them afterwards. So you can't really change the rules afterward unless you fall into the definition of a failed election within the meaning of this Electoral Count Act from the 1880s I described. But putting that to one side, the legislature can't do anything without the governor in the ordinary course. So there's just there's so much complexity to all this. I hope to God that I don't see Rick on CNN and myself, on other places talking about any of this. That would be very bad, even though likely we'll be saying some of the same things. It'll still be bad to hear it in stereo. So I'll turn it back to you, Jason.
Great. So the one thing that Vic didn't mention about the second of the Pennsylvania cases out of the Supreme Court, so the decision that came down yesterday, is Justice Alito wrote a statement in which he said, we really ought to take this case. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court extension is invalid, is unconstitutional. We should review it. The problem is there's not enough time right now, but the state has agreed to segregate the ballots that arrive after election day, and that will therefore allow us an opportunity to impose a remedy if necessary after election day. So I take it, Vic and Rick, that's sort of the worst case scenario.
It's the worst case scenario, and I find it totally implausible for two reasons. First, let's put the scenario on the table. So Biden wins North Carolina or Pennsylvania on election night or 2 days later when things are counted. And then 3 weeks after that, the Supreme Court says, well, you shouldn't have counted these ballots that were postmarked by election day, but received thereafter. And if you exclude those ballots, then Trump actually won those states and won the Electoral College. First, as Jason, you and I pointed out on balkanization today, that can't happen because people have been relying on this whole time. The Supreme Court denied the stay in the Pennsylvania and North Carolina cases. People are voting based on their reliance of that denial. And Alito can say what he said, trying to hold open this possibility, but he said it for 3. He didn't say it for 5. So if anything, it underscores that he doesn't speak for a majority, that a majority of the court didn't want to make that point, so people can continue to rely on the fact that their ballots are going to be counted. So Rick can send his ballot in 4 days rather than tomorrow or later today because he's paranoid about when it's going to arrive. He's counting on that kind of stuff. So that's point number 1. But even putting that aside, and I think that's a big legal point, putting that to aside, can you imagine after we count the ballots and we segregate them, the court coming back and saying, we're going to exclude these and change the results? You want civil unrest? You want people on the court being targeted for violence? That will happen then. And a lot of good-hearted, clear-minded people will probably not stand up against that because they'll be so outraged.
Well, let me just endorse your hope that we can go back to our normal lives as soon after November 3rd as possible, and that we don't have to be talking about these issues. I certainly feel the same about that. A couple of things that may reduce the anxiety about this issue. This is mostly speculative. I can't say this is true, but even before we get to the legal issue, there is a question about how many of these ballots are going to come in this 3-day window after the election that is now being legally contested. And that's for two reasons. The more obvious is we are seeing such staggering levels of turnout and participation already, including people who have requested absentee ballots and are getting them back incredibly early. And the higher the turnout, the greater the number of ballots would have to be that come in that 3-day window, to potentially have an effect on the outcome, number one. And number two, my understanding is the Biden campaign has actually been very sort of conservative in the approach it's been taking to these issues on the ground with its field operators who are out there, messaging to voters and talking to voters and educating voters. And so the Biden campaign has taken the view for a long time that it's not going to count on any of these court extended deadlines, of which there are only a few, but some in key states. It's not going to count on any of these court extended deadlines holding up. Maybe they'll hold up, maybe they're not going to hold up on appeal. But they continue to tell their voters, get those ballots back before Election Day or by Election Day, even if there was a court ruling that said you actually have 3 more days or 5 more days. And so the combination of those two factors may lead the number of ballots that are even in this category to begin with in a place like Pennsylvania to be much smaller compared to the overall vote totals. So I don't know how big a practical issue this will turn out to be. Obviously, it's a source of great concern. I think Vic is going to lose the substantive constitutional argument with the court, because I suspect going forward, there's going to be a majority on the court that is going to embrace the federal constitutional position that Vic has been arguing against, namely that legislatures have they're the only real policymakers when it comes to setting up the rules for the presidential election in their states. But I agree with Vic that I would be incredibly stunned if the Supreme Court were to say after the election, having let people vote under the understanding that their vote is valid if the absentee ballot comes in up to 3 days after the election. And then for a court majority to turn around and say, oh, sorry, actually those are invalid votes and we're throwing them out. I would be certainly stunned if the court came to that conclusion, even if they said going forward, or put another way, what the Pennsylvania Supreme Court did here violated the federal Constitution, and going forward, we would not permit this. But to apply that retroactively to voters who have already voted, not just under the understanding that this is valid, but the Supreme Court was given an opportunity to stop this from happening and declined to do it. And so I do agree that I would not expect the court to get to that point, even if we end up in a scenario and there are all these contingencies where Pennsylvania is decisive, where the number of ballots in this 3-day window could change the outcome in Pennsylvania. The case goes back to the Supreme Court, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I would be quite surprised if they pull the rug out from under voters in that way. And I agree with Vic that would probably trigger, if it were decisive in the election, I can't imagine in our context, it wouldn't trigger all sorts of things. Let's just put it that way. But let me actually say something more about the path that we could, if we want to imagine nightmare scenarios. You alluded to this, but I'm not sure people in the audience would kind of get this particular path. So the presidential election, as you know, is under a totally different timetable than any other election. It has to get resolved more quickly than any other election has to get resolved because the presidency, can't be open for any period of time. The inauguration is January 20th. The Constitution ends the current president's term on January 20th, regardless of anything else that's happening. And so when we have a disputed Senate election, like Minnesota had in the Coleman-Franken election, a Senate seat in Minnesota can be kept open, as that seat was for, I forgot the exact amount of time, but 6 or 9 months. Obviously, that can't happen with the presidency. And so the Electoral College and the statute that regulates it says the electors have to vote on December 18th. That's only 6 weeks after the election. And there's actually this other provision, we call it the safe harbor provision, which kicks in on December 8th, which is only 5 weeks after the election and could be an important date. Even under normal circumstances, any disputed issues in the presidential election, as we saw with Florida in 2000, where it ended up in court, is going to risk bumping up against that 5-week or 6-week window, or the closing of that window. And so if we're in a close election, and we have lots of absentee ballots still to process and count in critical states like Pennsylvania or Michigan or Wisconsin, which all do this process more slowly than states like Florida. You can imagine the process being dragged out, maybe even intentionally, with dragging it out as a strategy, but even if it's not an intentional strategy to drag it out, just the reality of the fights that would take place and the time it takes to sort them out, because of course the courts will be brought in after the fights take place with the election administrators. A state starting to bump up against that deadline. And then the provision in federal law that actually sets the Tuesday after the first Monday in November as the election day has this exception, which says if the election has failed in any state that's designed the election to choose the electors on November 3rd, if the election has failed, the legislature can appoint the electors in whatever manner the legislature decides. And so, as I have wondered about nightmare scenarios, that's one of the main ones I've worried about, that we start bumping up against the Electoral College deadlines and legislatures step in and say, we have this power the election has failed. We're not going to get to a clear final resolution of who's won the vote in Pennsylvania or Michigan or Wisconsin. And so we have to step in to make sure that there are a slate of electors from our state. And what will happen is Vic's right. It's not entirely clear how easy it would be for the legislatures to find a valid official who would certify the slate of electors the legislature might appoint. But the legislature has the power to choose the manner of appointing them. The governors in those states would probably quickly certify, as far as the count had gone, that person is the winner, even if the count wasn't final. And you'd have these two competing slates of electors, presumably one for Trump, one for Biden, both going to Congress when Congress convenes in a joint session on January 6th. It's the newly elected Congress to count the electoral votes, at which point Congress then has to decide which votes to count from a state if there are two slates or more from a state. In our most disputed election in our history, 1876, after the Civil War, that's basically the form the dispute took. We had 4 states that submitted 2 or more slates of electors. Actually, one state submitted 3 slates of electors to Congress. And then Congress had to decide how to decide which of these slates of electors to count. They created this ad hoc 15-member commission, which essentially decided the election. Then the statute was passed about a decade later to try to provide a rule structure and a framework if this ever happened again. Unfortunately, there are lots of questions about that statute. There are questions about whether it's even constitutional. There are questions about whether it actually binds Congress. There are questions about whether the courts would enforce it if Congress decides we're just not going to follow the statute. I mean, there are a lot, and substantively, there are questions about things like what is a failed election as a legal matter. So we don't want to get to any of those places. If we do, it will be we'll be in for a very, very difficult situation.
So Jason, real quickly. So yeah, I think Rick ended on a point. What a failed election is I think an important contested question. Some people would say, well, a failed election is anything where the result isn't kind of clean and clear and quick. But other people, myself included, have taken the position that failed election means an election that cannot generate a winner even after all the votes are counted and the dispute resolution process has run its course. So, for example, if a state had a requirement that you need a majority of votes to pick a group of electors, and there were 3 candidates who were basically splitting a third, no one could possibly get to 50%. But I would say there's a difference between a close/contested election and a failed election. And so we need to know kind of what those terms mean. I'm not, obviously, I don't necessarily agree with Rick that ultimately 5 or more members of the court will embrace the meaning of the word legislature. People said the same thing in the Arizona case. People were very surprised when 5 justices upheld that. Now it's different members of the court, but I don't think Roberts will kind of go back in that regard, and I'm not sure Barrett will, and I'm not even sure Kavanaugh will now, to be honest with you. After he reads and looks at more stuff. So that we'll have to wait and see. I mean, it would be odd to me if the court decided to take review to say that Pennsylvania legislature had violated the Constitution when it said, by the way, we're not going to provide any remedy because we can't or because it's irrelevant. Certainly if it's irrelevant, then why are you taking the case? And if you look ahead and you know you can't, then it seems a little gratuitous, although the counter argument is when else are you going to be able to provide guidance except in a situation like this after the fact? I want to just double back to an important point Rick made about not knowing how many ballots there are going to be in this category as against this increasingly large denominator and whether that's relevant. Jason, you and I wrote a piece, you'll remember, in the spring discussing the primary dispute in Wisconsin, where a district judge had extended the deadline so that votes would be counted up to 6 days, I believe, after the primary election date. The Supreme Court trimmed that back to say if your vote is postmarked on election day, it will count, but it can't be postmarked after election day. And we thought that was perfectly appropriate. Indeed, we weren't even sure there was a federal constitutional violation in the first place, as we wrote. So, we come out different ways in these disputes. We're not consistently, Republican or Democrat in these instincts. But one of the things you and I talked about afterward, do you remember, when we saw news accounts of how many votes actually came in that were postmarked after the election date, it turns out to be far fewer than anyone realized or feared. And I think Rick's right, the same might be true in this instance for the reasons that he identified.
Well, I'd even go further on that. When Wisconsin was voting in its April 7th primary, that was about as chaotic an election as we had during this entire cycle, because most states by then had decided to postpone their presidential primaries for several months till June. Wisconsin was the only state that went forward. This was in the relatively early first month or so of the shutdowns and the real scope of the pandemic. No one understood very much at all about this disease. And it was unbelievably chaotic because the governor wanted to postpone the election. He said he didn't have the power to do it, but it should be done. He called the legislature to session. They said, no, we're not going to postpone it. In the last week before the election, the governor did issue an order to postpone it. Then the state court came in and said, no, he violated his authority. So, I mean, voters were in an incredibly chaotic and confused situation. And I had no time to prepare for the situation, unlike this fall election where people have seen mail delays from the Postal Service, have been getting messaging from the campaigns to get their ballots in, where they've had really significant early voting options. And so even given what you said, Vic, about the numbers in Wisconsin back then, there are all these reasons to think that might be a far higher percentage of voters that would get their ballots back after Election Day than in that April 7th primary. We'll have to see. But there are reasons to think, we need to keep this in perspective also as we deal with anxieties about what the court might do.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
I think that's right. And I think the difference in the underlying chaos, as you put it, April compared to, I think that accounts for why Judge Easterbrook on the Seventh Circuit this time around, when the Wisconsin's desire to adhere to the requirement that all ballots be received by Election Day, why he upheld that, and why the court upheld his upholding of that, and why there wasn't a bigger kind of outcry backlash that there was in April. Because people are on much greater notice now. Jason and I pointed out that the websites in Wisconsin always told people, "Hey, assume the worst and act early." But you're right that that was a much more chaotic time than now. So I think it counts not just for kind of the remedial relevances, but also even on the merits of these claims.
So we only have a couple of minutes left. Rick, can I circle back to where you started and ask you about the ballots that are being mailed in very large numbers. How quickly are they being counted? What portion will be counted by the end of Election Day or soon thereafter? And what are the potential challenges to individual ballots? Or is there a possibility of something equivalent to the hanging chads that we saw 20 years ago?
So the answer to your question, as with so much of our election process, is that it varies enormously by state. And one of the things that varies is what state law says to its election officials about when they're permitted to start processing the absentee ballots. That doesn't mean counting them. It means doing everything necessary to get them ready to be counted. And so to contrast Florida with Pennsylvania, right now, Florida, as it's been doing since, I forgot the date, but 3 weeks before Election Day, Florida election officials, by state law, have the power to start processing these absentee ballots. And it takes time to process each ballot. And if you think about millions of ballots, like in Florida or Pennsylvania, the estimate in Pennsylvania is that maybe 1.5 to 2 million votes are going to be cast by absentee ballot. A small amount of time per ballot adds up to a lot of time. So they have to, depending on the state law, they have to verify from the ballot envelope that everything has been done to make sure this is a valid ballot or valid. The signature in some states has to be compared to the signature on file. Some states require a witness to sign that ballot. They have to look to see if the witness signature is there. The ballot has to be removed from the envelope. That actually takes a little bit of time. It has to be flattened if necessary so it can be put into the counting machines. All of that's happening in Florida right now. None of that's happening in Pennsylvania right now. Pennsylvania law doesn't allow the election officials to start just even the processing of these ballots till Election Day. And as I said earlier, I have been arguing, doing events in Pennsylvania, doing everything I can to call attention, as have others, to the need to change this policy in Pennsylvania. The legislature, and by the way, all the election administrators in Pennsylvania are basically begging their state officials to give them that power. The legislature was willing to let that process start 3 days before Election Day, but they put it in legislation that had other policies on voting issues that the Democratic governor, wasn't prepared to accept. He was demanding that they be allowed to start processing 21 days before Election Day. And so, this is a perfect example of how dysfunctional our politics is. So you have, two parties. It's obviously good policy. And the legislature actually wants to do it, and the governor wants to do it too, to at least allow the processing of these ballots to have started 3 days before election. But they just they cannot get themselves to a place where they can find some sort of agreement on that. So the whole thing blows up. None of these issues get addressed. And they throw the country into a, potentially explosive situation by creating a situation which inherently means that we won't have a final count in Pennsylvania for later than would be necessary if they simply did what Florida and many other states do, which is allow this processing to go forward. So that's why the answer as to how long it'll take in different states varies. And also, of course, that opens up more challenges to these ballots after the election, where the intensity will be through the roof if it looks like any of these states, which are just beginning to process their absentee ballots, could be outcome determinative.
Can I, before we break up, Jason and I have to leave too, but I want to ask Rick a follow-up question about this, because, until this year, I had not realized that there are, 5 or more states that don't allow processing, much less counting of ballots received prior to after election day itself. I understand the political dysfunction. I get that. But what plausible policy rationale ever justified this? Where does this come from? Were these policies enacted at a time when there were just so few ballots of this kind that it just didn't matter because it was so easy to deal with them on election night? Where the heck, why would you want to just let this, is it a concern that you can't trust these election officials to keep the information to themselves and they'll leak it and infect the election? I mean, what? Yeah,
so, I have wondered about that question too. I certainly never really thought much about this issue before this election. I haven't gone back to look into the history of any of these policies, but you've tapped into the things that I've always kind of assumed are the reasons for it. Number one, lots of these places are used to having very low volumes of absentee voting. So, they're suddenly thrust into this brave new world, of 10 times higher absentee ballot rates than normal. And the laws weren't written for that. And then I think, as you say, the concern had been, especially when these laws were first enacted, and maybe some of these systems were more corrupt, that numbers would leak out, and that could affect the voting and, all the concerns about releasing numbers while people are still voting or even before they start voting. That's my understanding, but I can't claim to have delved deeply into it.
Thanks.
Well, great. We don't want to keep you, Rick, more than the hour we paid for. So,
Did you pay for it?
No, but thank you so much.
Checks in the mail, Rick.
I hope it comes. I hope I managed to get myself to vote before the check gets here.
The check is valid up to 3 days after election.
Well, thank you guys for inviting me, and thanks for the good discussion. Good talking to both of you, and good seeing everybody on Zoom.
And we'll see you on the other side, Rick.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you both. Thanks, Rick. I appreciate it too.
Thank you, Jason.
And thanks to everyone for joining us. Good evening.